Before you tonight is a presentation by Cobalt Community Research on the City of Oak Creek's Resident Priority Survey. For the Council and Community's awareness, this is our third Resident Priority Survey, first occurring in 2011, second iteration in 2016, and then this last one in January of 2022. And really the survey results will help us in informing the next iteration of the strategic action plan, as well as making decisions and priorities for budgeting processes in the future. And with that, I will turn it over to the Executive Director, Cobalt Community Research, William St. Amour.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I'm in the process of switching over my screen so that you can stare at things as I walk you through it.
Yeah, we need some volume on that. If you get control of that.
Can you hear me now?
Better.
Okay, good. So just some background information on Cobalt and who we are and what we do. We're a 501c3. We're based just across the lake from you over in Michigan. We work with communities across the country on these kinds of engagements. Why research matters? There's a number of important reasons. One is just looking at the values and priorities that your residents have, making sure that you're engaging with them regularly to help you communicate more effectively about what's going on, and really to help you guide city decisions and then talk about city decisions as well. Understanding the perception also helps you promote the services and programs provided by the city, because there's often a mismatch between people's expectations and what the city offers. So this helps build some of that alignment. Helps with difficult decisions that you might be looking at, particularly with resource kinds of decisions or ordinances. Helps you balance demands of local minorities with the reality of limited resources. And ultimately, this is just a great trust building exercise. It's an opportunity for people to share their ideas, to share their concerns, and know that they're being heard. So for this particular study, there's several things that we wanted to achieve. One is really supporting the budget and strategic planning decisions that you're going into. We have a baseline that's been established for the city since 2011. So looking to see how you're performing compared to those long-term trends. Look to see which areas have the most impact in terms of driving overall satisfaction and other outcomes, like people remaining in the community and recommending it to others, because not all scores are created equal. Some have a disproportionate effect on those kinds of outcomes. There's a lot of benchmarking in here that we'll talk about. And we also wanted to make sure that we looked at different demographic groups so that all of those different groups had their voices heard. So let me first jump in and talk about the bottom line. So this is basically the survey in a nutshell. So first of all, you did really well. You outperformed most of the benchmarks, certainly everything in Wisconsin, but you're at or above many of the national and regional benchmarks as well. There were 6 areas that were the most strongly linked with overall satisfaction, and these are not low scores. These are just the scores that were the most closely connected with those kind of outcomes. And those are local government management, taxes, image, website, customer service experiences, and economic health. And I'll be going into those in more detail here in just a couple minutes. We had a question where we were asking about different approaches for additional officers and tying that into some different tax costs. And people were generally open to that kind of approach. We'll go into that in more detail too. They've been using parks a lot in the library, more limited use of public health. We asked which streets need the most attention from a maintenance standpoint. Drexel, and I always get challenged with this particular street name, Putes, Rawson, and Forest Hill. Residents are also very interested in biking and walking infrastructure in general, and we see that coming out in the survey in a number of different ways. They are willing to fund increased infrastructure maintenance. Not so much new stuff, but certainly with the maintenance, there's support for doing that. When we asked them about the vision for the city in the future, the kind of things that came out were much more of a family orientation and focused on building a sense of community and all the different things that you can do to really continue to nurture that and make that top of mind. Top concerns they had: taxes, housing, and some of the challenges with schools. All right, so that was the nickel summary of the results. Let me talk a little bit about the methodology. So we sent this out to just over 1,700 folks. They were drawn from the city's voting records. We did 2 waves in January and March. Everyone had a unique ID number, so they couldn't respond more than once, have their votes basically counted more than once. We heard back from 389 residents, which is fantastic. It gives us a margin of error of plus or minus 4.9%. To give you a sense of if that's enough for a community of your size, for a national survey to get plus or minus 5%, you need 384 responses. So you're right in there. So that's really a solid response from a statistical standpoint. In addition to those folks, we also provided the opportunity for people who weren't part of the sample to share their ideas as well. And we had 146 people who took you up on that. And so that brought the overall response to 535 residents. And just as a quick note, we don't mix the non-respondent or the non-sample folks with the sample folks, just so that we could generalize it. So we keep those two separate. So in the detailed information that you have, you'll see most of the stats are for the sample, but then you'll have a separate line going across to capture the folks who are not part of the sample and see what their opinions were. Response pattern, very similar to prior years. The only difference is there was a little bit of an increase in the number of retired responses and a little bit of a decline of people who work outside the city. And we have all of those details in the crosstabs available to council. So number of tools that you have available. We do comparison scores with other local governments in our annual index across the Midwest, across the nation, and also for Wisconsin, because we do oversample for Wisconsin as well. We compare the scores also to non-governmental groups, and this is part of the American Customer Satisfaction Index. So you can compare to different industries, different companies, and just get a sense of how well you perform against some of these other kinds of entities. And the reason that we do that is because your residents often don't compare your performance with the performance of other communities across the state. Instead, they compare your performance with other organizations they do business with, whether it's a bank or insurance company or whatever. But this just allows you to have some of that additional context if you want to dig into it. And last of all, we do some crosstabs where we do a lot of thermal mapping so that you're able to really look through a lot of data and draw your eye right to some of the patterns. And I'll talk about that here in the next slide, if it comes up. So this is a tiny sample of what it offers. So basically every question in the survey is its own row and its own column, and every demographic group in the survey is its own row. So this is just a handful of them. It actually goes on, it's a huge, huge file. But we shade things with higher scores of blue, lower scores are more of the reddish pink, white is kind of neutral in the middle. And you can see generally where the scores are higher and lower because of the coloration, but also if you drop down the columns, if it's pretty consistently the same shade, then you know that regardless of demographic cohort, people are having basically the same experience or have the same kind of perceptions. If you have a little bit more checkering, then that tells you that maybe there's a particular cohort of folks that are having a bit of a different experience. So as you're having conversations out in the community, you can have a more detailed kind of question instead of just how are things going in general. Instead, you can say, what are some specific things that we could do with public health to make your experience better? And have that more detailed kind of conversation. All right. So that was the general stuff. Now we'll start diving into the results. So your scores and context, they're here in blue for some of the summary things we wanted to point out. You can see that your scores outperform Wisconsin pretty much across every metric. Then you are above or at the benchmarks for similarly sized communities in the Midwest overall, across the nation, for similarly sized communities across the nation overall. So very solid. You've been working on the stuff that you deliver, and you're doing a good job overall. Now we wanted to take a look also at your performance compared to the last few iterations of the survey. So what we're doing here is just giving you some of that additional context, and then you can see, are you above or below those benchmarks? This is just a summary of all of the questions. And the areas that are in green are those 6 areas that are the most strongly correlated with overall satisfaction. So you can see taxes, that score dipped a little bit. Local management dipped a little bit. Economic health overall stayed about even from a statistical standpoint because it's plus or minus 4.9%, and so on. So website had a big jump as well. And I'll go into these in more detail as well. So one of the things that we look at is not just satisfaction, but certain outcome behaviors that communities care about. Those are things like recommending Oak Creek as a place to live, remaining there for the next 5 years, being a community volunteer, encouraging someone to start a business in Oak Creek, and supporting Oak Creek government. So what we do is we have your scores for 2011 in this gray color. The light blue is your 2016 score, and the dark blue is your 2022 score. Then the green is the Wisconsin benchmark. The yellow is Midwest similarly sized. Brown is Midwest overall. Red is national similarly sized. And the darker red is national overall. So just to give you some of that context as we go through these scores. And again, for the most part, you are above the benchmarks or at the benchmarks for most of the scores. You can see, be a community volunteer, you drop quite a bit and you're below the benchmark. So that's something that you may want to pay some attention to, particularly some of the themes about community engagement and community involvement. So that's an area that you might want to just jot down and think about as you go into the planning. Encouraging someone to start a business in Oak Creek, you can see that's been slipping down, still outperforming Wisconsin in a very solid way, but that's something that you want to keep an eye on as well. So we use a lot of bubble charts. We didn't throw so many at council because we wanted to get home before midnight, but staff have seen a million of these. Essentially, the way that you read them is that the top 2 quadrants are your relative strengths, your bottom 2 quadrants are your relative weaknesses. The biggest drivers in terms of the things that are the most closely linked with overall satisfaction are on the right, and the ones that are more optimized and aren't as strongly linked currently are on the left. So this next chart is going to be a little bit of an eye chart. This is basically every question in the survey just dumped onto this thing. But this just allows you to see that by color, things tend to cluster in certain ways. So staff have been looking at this in more detail. We're not going to go over this level of detail tonight. So instead what we did is we just backed off, looked at the overall scores for each of these areas so that you can see the relative performance of each. So these 6 bubbles over here are the 6 that we had listed there on the summary page. So these are things like city hall experiences, city management, economic health, image, the website, and 34 down here, which is taxes. 112, which is right here on the line, is social media. So again, pretty much optimized for the things that are over here, including some of the housing issues, things that are more of a driver that have a lot of sizzle in them in terms of moving your score up are on this side, whether it's a relatively lower performing area or relatively higher performing area. One other thing I want to mention is that your lowest scoring area is still a 45, which is not a bad score. Most of your other scores are well above that. So this is not a chart that says, oh, you have these terrible problems. Instead, this is a chart to use for tuning to help you continue to ratchet up the experiences that folks have with the community. One of the things that often come up is some of the things that are up here in this quadrant are things like police and fire department, fire and EMS. The fact that they're up here does not mean that they're not important. That's not what this chart is looking at. Instead, this is looking at more of a differentiation between services and those outcome behaviors. So if you think about buying a car, and one of the things that help you choose between one car and another car might be things like the mileage that it gets, or the styling, or the price. It's not whether or not it has a steering wheel. And police and fire are often something that's just expected to work within the community. And in your case, they are. But that's kind of how you read it. These are the things that differentiate, like the mileage or the styling or the pricing. These are the things that are just, they're solid, they're doing well, but it's not the thing that helps people choose between your community and another community. All right, this is the most painful chart that I'll be sharing, and then it gets easier from here. So what we're looking at is overall image, so the brand that Oak Creek has in the minds of your residents. Same sort of set of colors that we talked about before. I just want to talk about some of the highlights here. One is high scores for an enjoyable place for children, a safe place to live, enjoyable place for families, physically attractive, a great place to live, brings the community together. All fantastic things and very consistent with that vision that people want long-term for the city. Areas that are softer scores are things like growing responsibly, a safe place to walk at night, and an enjoyable place for single adults. Looking at your fire and EMS, very high scores. You can see them up here, flirting with the 90 line. These are fantastic scores above the benchmarks. They're only getting better. You've got a great team that are doing a fantastic job. Police services, very similar story. So improving in most of these areas, well above the benchmarks. The enforcing the traffic laws doesn't have comparison with other benchmarks, which is why it's blank over here. But again, very solid scores, but a little bit softer than it was back in 2016. One of the things that we've been looking at with police, particularly given some of the things in Minneapolis and out in Portland, is breaking apart the results by different ethnic group and by age to see if there's any significant differences. And what we see is, other than the 18 to 24-year-old group, for the most part, the experiences are very consistent across demographics, which is very encouraging. One area that was particularly low was safety education. So that's something to keep an eye on. There's a fairly small group of people responding in this particular age group, so you get a lot more variation in that kind of response. But one thing we've seen with a lot of our clients across the country is with COVID, educational programs, both for fire and for police, have not been as robust because not able to get in the schools and just festivals and other areas where that training kind of took place. So thinking about safety education and how to start re-engaging the community on some of those types of things. The proposal regarding the police. So this was looking at some different scenarios as far as providing funding for various levels of police to be hired. In general, about 34% of your residents said, yes, I support this. Only 15% said no. You had another 32% or so saying that no, they don't support this particular approach, but they would support some sort of alternative option. And then you've got a lot of folks who are in need of more information. So I think overall there is support for this kind of approach to increase your police staffing. Very few people said no. It's just a matter of finding the right mix to make sure that the needs are accommodated. Customer service for the city, again, above the benchmarks for most of the areas. Follow-up provided by staff was a little bit weaker, but still you're outperforming Wisconsin. Really high scores for the professionalism and courtesy of staff. So that does not happen automatically. So that's been something that you've chosen the right people, you've given them the right training, they're really doing a nice job there. Local government management, similar sort of story. Your scores for the most part are well above the benchmarks, particularly having employees who are well trained. The open to citizen ideas and involvement softened quite a bit, and you dipped below the benchmark. So I wanted to point that out. Managing community growth is another one that dipped pretty significantly. So you'll want to jot those down as things to think about here in the coming weeks. Economic health, for the most part, again, around the benchmarks. So you've got the economic health overall over here. The areas that were particularly strong is the strength of the local economy, the stability of property values, a little bit softer with the affordability of housing. You can see you're still outperforming Wisconsin, but Wisconsin in general has had a significant increase in terms of housing prices. The availability of jobs has gone up, but it's still lagging somewhat. And there's another one, cost of living has also become more problematic. Again, well above Wisconsin, but inflation is certainly having some effect on folks. Looking at housing affordability specifically, this wasn't as strong of a driver for the community overall because most of your community has housing already, but it is an issue that's showing up for some of your younger residents, folks that have lower household income levels. And you can see that compared to 2016, across the board, housing affordability has dropped pretty significantly. When we look at housing availability, also fairly low scores, hasn't dropped as much for the most part, but you can still see that these have dropped quite a bit from 2016. So single family residential housing, in particular, housing choices for college graduates and young families also dropped significantly. Library services. Libraries have been some heroes throughout this COVID period, and your staff there have been doing a fantastic job. Scores overall are going up above the benchmarks. So really across all of the different questions, the hours of operations were your lowest score. Customer service, again, as we saw with other things, looking at your staff, very high score. Looking at the use of the library, so only about 23% of your residents did not use the library at all in the past past 12 months. And then you can see the breakdown for that. So pretty high use. Looking at parks, again, we've seen utilization of parks increasing across all of the different communities that we work with. Your parks are doing a great job, again, above the benchmark for the most part, improving compared to prior surveys. We also added a couple of questions looking at some rental options. So we have a baseline for those. We don't have benchmarks across other cities to look at those two particular questions. So we'll just see that develop over time. Park use. If you look at the percentage that never use it, so only about 12%, and the rest are pretty heavy users of your park system. And this will tie in when we're looking at walking and trails and biking and some of those kind of things. Transportation. Transportation is always a challenge, particularly with communities in the Midwest. You're doing a pretty good job for the most part. Your higher scores, road signage, street lighting, traffic signals, bridge maintenance and repair are all good. Lower scores for public transportation options, and also the accommodation for bicycle and foot. And then your street maintenance and repair, again, above the benchmarks, but there's always opportunity for improvement there. When we asked which specific streets are in special need of repair, we did a word cloud. So the words that came up most often, the street names that came up most often are the largest. And so you can see that for yourself. We've got Drexel, we've got Buttes, we've got Rawson and Forest Hill all popping up in a pretty big way. Looking at potential new transportation elements. Roundabouts, speed bumps, traffic circles, pedestrian curb bump outs, illuminated pedestrian crossings, and expanded walking and biking trails and lanes. You see, for the most part, not a lot of support for many of these, but pretty significant support for the pedestrian crossings and the expanded walking and biking trails. When we asked if they would be willing to pay more for these things, most folks, this orange, said, no, we really don't want to pay anything new for those new elements. And then you can see the folks that are in favor of those. The ones that had the most support in terms of mechanisms to pay for them are federal taxes and state taxes to get some of that funding available. When we then looked at existing infrastructure repair and replacement, we have a different story. So here, when we looked at additional funding, only about 41% said, no, I don't want to pay anything in addition to maintain what we already have. But we have about 56% who said, yes, I am willing to pay something. And basically this column here is the sum of all of these smaller columns. So you can see what that distribution looks like in terms of how much they would be willing to pay. So probably about, if we were to look at these last 5 columns, you'd probably be down just around the 48% willing to pay $11 or more on a monthly basis. Utility services, again, strong performance, pretty high scores. You know, drinking water quality is excellent. Garbage collection, a little bit softer with the recycling collection, and stormwater management. Taxes, everyone hates taxes. Your scores have gone down a bit compared to prior surveys. The areas that were the lowest were the fairness of taxes, fairness of property assessments, and city communications on how tax dollars are used. And all of these are things that are often linked, and it ties into how well you do the storytelling regarding this particular topic, which can be tricky. But looking at the offerings that the city has, as well as the comparatively low tax rate that you have in the area, there's a lot of things that you could do as far as increasing the public's understanding of what you're able to do very responsibly for a very reasonable cost compared to what they're paying in other communities. Looking at the website, we've seen an increase across the board for all of the website elements. I know that your website was revamped, so it's been effective. So you've had a nice increase, and you're outperforming the benchmarks. Social media, we've had a little bit of a dip in the social media scores, particularly the ability to interact with staff to get questions answered. We had an open-ended question about what are the most important issues that's facing the city. And again, we use the word clouds. The things that were the most often mentioned are the largest words. The main things, taxes. So property tax increase was something that came up pretty often. Housing, in terms of the accessibility and the affordability of housing, came up in a lot of the comments as well. And then there were also a number of comments regarding the schools in terms of some of the challenges in terms of the ranking and also the response to COVID, which made it a little bit challenging for the district as well as for parents. We asked about folks' vision for Oak Creek in the next 10 years. What are the things they would like to see? And the things that came out is really building a strong sense of community. So having, activities and involvement for people to get out and come together. A lot of things around family and having a lot of opportunities for families to do things with parks and recreational programs and schools, and improved affordability of taxes and housing. So those were the two that came up along those lines. Finally, we had a question that was pretty broad. It was looking at the various economic development projects, retail establishments, food and beverage clusters, nightlife opportunities, park amenities, and so on that people would like to see either added or enhanced. And what folks wanted to see the most were restaurants, first of all. You can see that marched right across the middle, particularly non-chain kinds of restaurants. So either fine dining, higher end kind of things, or things that were family friendly. The next largest theme that we came across were parks and programs and recreational kind of things, more green spaces. People are concerned about the growth is eating more and more of the space, so they want to make sure that that's locked in and the infrastructure is there for walks, for sporting events, for all of those kind of things. And then the last thing that came up is pool aquatic center kind of themes. So kind of the fun in the sun sort of opportunities that people want to do, get swimming lessons and so on. We asked about special events. A lot of music kind of things came through. A lot of food kind of themes came through. Beer gardens came through. Craft fairs. So there's a huge opportunity, a huge appetite to do more in this area as well. And again, it ties in with the theme of just the community engagement and family-friendly things and so on. So we're approaching the end. There are some questions specific to budget and planning. We were asking about support for increased funding for a number of different areas and whether they oppose in red or if they support the tax in blue. So there's a few of them that I wanted to highlight where the support was quite a bit stronger. Fire and EMS had a lot of support. There's a lot of support as well for roadway maintenance, police department, street light maintenance, the state streets, parks, forestry department services, parks and trail improvements, and preservation of open spaces. All of those had support that exceeded opposition. Looking at other types of potential new initiatives, this was a wish list that was just put together to see what people were the most interested in. And the things that people are most interested in is the street lighting, converting it over to LEDs to be more efficient. And then to a lesser extent, looking at loans and grant programs for small businesses and programs to promote an active and healthy Oak Creek. So again, tying in with the walking, the biking, the parks, and those kinds of things. We asked the question about chickens, and 50% support the idea of having backyard chickens. about 33% opposed, and there's a few folks on the fence. And if you ask about chickens, the next thing coming down the line is backyard bees, which has even more support. Almost 60% of folks are comfortable with the backyard bees being permitted. Couple of questions on communication preference. How do people prefer to receive information from the city? The newsletter, the Acorn, was #1, followed by the Oak Creek Current magazine, and then your website, and then Facebook. And those do vary quite a bit by the age of the respondents. So you can see things like the newsletter, darker blue in terms of use as people get older, things like Facebook, you know, that kind of fades off, not as much support as people get older, more support with younger folks. Website generally has a younger skew. So really, as you develop this kind of information, making sure you're choosing the right modality to send it out, depending on which particular group you're trying to get it in front of. So implementing results. As you think about these scores, think about whether the perception on the things that you want to change, if the score is there because of a perception gap, that things are actually different than what people think. And if that's the case, a perception gap is addressed with communication, education, outreach, those kinds of things. If it's a performance gap where you're actually not performing at the level that you'd like to, then it's really a question of what are the kind of resource changes, the process changes, the tools, the training that needs to go in place to close that performance gap. And once it becomes a performance gap, keep in mind that you'll still have a perception gap and that you'll need to wrap a communications campaign around it to let people know that, you know, this used to be a problem and now it's been addressed. Often that's not done, and as you dive into some of your crosstabs, you'll see that some of your scores for people who have been residents for a long time tend to be lower than folks who have been there for a shorter period of time. And some of that is because of issues that occurred years ago and they didn't know it's been resolved. They've kind of held on to that over a number of years. So a process that's generally used in terms of approaching the results and making sure that they're implemented. You've done the first step, which is measuring. The next step is really to go into a brainstorming phase where you take a couple of big flip chart paper stands and you create 2 lists. The first list is what are the specific things that we want to change? What are the scores that bug us the most? And then the second thing is, why do people respond to that? Or respond in that way? What are some things that we can do potentially to improve those scores? Then you go to a validation phase where you take those lists and you expand the conversation out to line staff, to maybe some workshops out in the community, and say, okay, here's the things that we want to improve the scores on. Here's some of the ideas that we came up with. Number 1, what's missing? And number 2, what are the 2 or 3 things that would really be the most impactful? Once you've got your 2 or 3 things, then you decide who's going to implement them and make sure that those folks have the right equipment and the right training to implement successfully. Then the implementation process itself is just process management. So who's going to do what? What's the timetable? How are you going to measure progress to make sure that that momentum continues? And then you'll come back again in a few years and measure again to see if you've made progress on those things that you wanted to make progress on. And then also think about how the priorities of the community have shifted as the economic and the political and the social environment shift. So with that, I've done a lot of talking, and now I'll stop and answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. I'll open it up for questions or comments. Andrew, do you want to start?
Are we live, Kevin? Sure, yeah, just a couple points. And then after we hear your questions and we have a little dialogue, I'll come back and talk about kind of the next steps of this data, some of the stuff that Will just pointed out on that last slide there. Just to reiterate a couple things. Number 1, the staff didn't want to come here tonight with a bunch of our own observations and color to qualifying the data and what we thought meant what. That's really going to be part of our strategic planning process. We wanted you to hear from Will, the kind of the third-party proctor of the survey, the raw detail, and as well as the community listening in or viewing later. But just to reiterate a couple points, you can see by and large we were above all the metrics for all of the other overlying kind of bands and those parallel or those bar graphs. You can see that we had some dips from year to year, but the general buckets were outperforming the Midwest, the nation, the state of Wisconsin, et cetera. So that was really good to see.
Just to reiterate, and I may have you move around on some slides, Will, while we're here, but just to reiterate something to think of when you're going through these data and more detailed information we'll be giving you. The higher connection, the higher satisfaction. This is something that Max has preached to us as we've been kind of talking about this. Your investments that we made in things that we know we did well, website, communication, branding and imaging, those are high connection, high satisfaction. So that doesn't mean you ignore those and focus on only those items that you scored lower on, because actually doubling down on those investments, doing things in terms of brand and image and community cleanliness and aesthetic with our neighborhood preservation program, the pending corridor project, the Gateway project on Drexel. It's not about ignoring what we're doing well. It's actually, those have the highest impact of how they view, the residents view us overall as a community. So we have to continue to drive investment in those high impact items, not just focus on the things we want to bring up. Really good point that Will had made there. You guys will love this one. Number 3, this is not a mandate to do or not to do anything, right? There are connective tissues that the Common Council, as the elected leadership in the community, along with the senior staff, need to tie in and say, yeah, they said this here, but they also said this here. How do we reconnect those two? Because they want to invest in police, they want to invest in green spaces, they want to invest in fire and EMS, but only just a little. So how do we reconcile that? You know, what does $11 get us, or whatever the metric is that they were willing to pay? So it's a willingness to invest in certain things that are important to them, but not too much. And that's where you have to reconcile what all that means. Kind of to further that point, Will, if you could go to the strategic initiatives slides a couple of points ago, where we asked very generally,
Do you have the page number on that offhand?
I don't. It's where we asked investing in LED, the LED slide, where that was scored really high.
Yep, I know the one you're talking about. That one.
Yeah, so looking at a couple of these, and then drawing back to the previous point I made. Yeah, we're willing to invest in police, but we want an alternative strategy. Maybe that means other than property taxes, or maybe it's a little too much that you're asking for, but we're open to another solution. You see, there's no context to these strategic initiatives. We kind of wanted to get a raw reaction on what people thought. If you were to say, we would like to convert streetlights to more energy efficient LEDs to save taxpayer dollars, I bet we would have got closer to 100% of everybody saying that's great. Furthering that point, if we would have said, hey, we want to look at efficiencies we can gain by a more connected utility and common council in order to save taxpayer dollars, with which we might put more cops on the streets or help reduce our fire and EMS time, that score would have went way up as well. So that's what I'm talking about with the Common Council now, with the leadership, the staff, really kind of connecting. They want more cops. They don't necessarily want to pay. They want to reduce EMS times and more fire and EMS on the street. So you guys have to get there as to how. And we know that some of those strategic initiatives could really help move some money around and really open up some resources. Another great example, you know, if we were to have included the verbiage, or if we come up with a strategy that says, hey, we'd like to invest in some homeowner grant or loan programs so single family homeowners can make investments in their property, but not with general taxpayer dollars, probably would have went way up. And there's strategies around that. There's state funding, federal funding. There's our own ARPA dollars that could be a strategy there, where we're not using general taxpayer dollars, but we have investment vehicles that aren't the general property tax levy. So just to qualify those a little bit. And with that, I'll turn it over to you all, and we'll talk a little bit about next steps at the end. But really think about when you get this larger data set, because you'll be getting the a much less abridged version of this presentation, along with the open-ended Q&A. And you really need to think about high satisfaction, high connection, high satisfaction, and really what it all means, because there's a little bit of, not to put this in any negative way, but there's a little bit of hypocrisy. And I think housing needs to be more affordable, but I don't want to invest in affordable housing. Well, what does that mean? How do we sort that out? And lastly, on a more positive note, we heard loud and clear that Drexel Avenue was going to be a priority. We actually received a call from a gentleman a day before the Drexel streetscape or the Drexel roadway closed. So that's how quickly we act here in the city of Oak Creek. We didn't even get your approval on that one. We had Drexel under construction the day we received the survey results. So for anybody listening at home or viewing in 5 years, I'm joking. That's my form of sarcasm, but we did have a good laugh about that we act very quickly here in local government in Oak Creek. So
great. Thank you, Andrew. We'll open it up. Comments, questions from the council. Rich.
Alderman Dukenyak, 3rd District, and Max and Andrew, you will probably be able to answer this. I mean, there's going to be significant discussion with this information that we've received. Will at some point this be shared with the general public? And I have some concerns about that. And you had mentioned, Andrew, this information can be very easily misconstrued. I mean, so I'm just wondering, is that typical in a survey to eventually share it with those that participated?
So, thank you, Alderman Dukenyak. So yes, all the information that's been provided by Cobalt Community Research is on the city website at the link that was provided in the Common Council report. So all the crosstab data, all of the narrative responses to the questions, the open-ended responses as well. That's pretty consistent with how we did and presented the information from 2011 and 2016. Really the question is how many people are actually going to then go to the city website to really read through the results. Certainly we can do a campaign through social media or other communication platforms to really advertise that. But, certainly there's a large educational piece to it, to really educate residents that, again, not the end all be all, but just data points that need to inform the strategic plan, and the budget process.
Andrew, I like what you said, and we really need then to communicate that with residents, that the survey results, if they were very positive, doesn't necessarily mean that that's a mandate for that action. Is there a plan that's used to try and educate our residents how to interpret this information?
So I think, that's not necessarily an education campaign that is going to mean much to a lot of people unless they're trying to use the data for a specific purpose.
I know.
We know where we're going with this. So,
yeah.
I think it's just really important to note that we've heard you with this specific idea or this specific interest, and we've heard from our random sample of our community survey, and with that we're going to make an informed decision about whether or not or what we are going to do with that information. So I would just stress that we won't know who may have a specific interest in using the data, and it's in an education campaign to say, wait, we'll use this information how we want, I think would be a little bit disingenuous. Proactively, I think that's just the communication you have to do kind of on a one-off or an individualized basis when somebody's kind of waving the data at you.
Sure.
Greg?
I'm just curious, slide number 6 noted that 146 people that weren't part of the sample responded. Where did those people come from? Was it were they forwarded the link via email? Are they spouses of the people in the sample? Where did the 146 come from?
So when we do a survey, we provide opportunity for folks who aren't part of the sample to participate. The folks who are in the sample have a specific unique ID number, so we can identify those folks. The folks who choose to participate, they hear it through, it's on the city website. They know someone who received a survey, for example. They could go out to cobaltcommunityresearch.org/Oak Creek, and they could type in Oak Creek as the survey ID number and take it that way.
Maybe to add to that a little bit.
I can add that Leslie posted a Facebook page where you could go, if you didn't get the mailing, you could go to the link and take the survey.
Another qualification of the data, which was anticipated was going to occur, was we reached more single family owner occupied residents than we did leased residence situations by a lot. Not reflective of what we know our population to be, probably approaching 40 to 45% of our community living in a leased residence situation. But we also, in addition to the general Facebook posts where anybody could access the kind of the non-sample, we push this out to our apartment managers contacts that we have to get to their individual community listservs. We pushed it out to a few of the senior and yet independent living arrangements in the community. So we did try to get it out that way to broaden the response, and then the data the council will get, you'll be able to see this is the detailed, well, not the full detail, but this is a synopsis presentation of the random. You'll be able to see, wow, there's a little bit of a difference there in the 146 to the 384. But with the random sample being statistically significant, you should be pretty, you shouldn't see a lot of deviation from the responses in those 146. That's the true scientific, I guess that's the science behind, statistical analysis.
Another thing, I know that this was a city initiative, and while we don't have direct oversight with anything with the school district, does that small portion of the survey get shared with anybody in the school district, since there was responses with concerns to that?
So it certainly could. We'll definitely make the community leaders or the school district leadership aware, but I think, to the point, the average resident may not divorce municipal government from school board politics or governance. To them, they just live in the city, right? They're not as engaged in how the breakdown of local government responsibility is as folks like the elected officials and the staff who work in local government. So, and you can see, some of the things that you saw in those bar graphs that actually dip down from one year or one survey in 2016 to the next it's abundantly clear that national politics that trickle down to the local level influence those types of things, that the school district everywhere, when you pass a referendum, those are usually very close, and either 40% of the people hate you or 60% of the people hate you. That's kind of how it works, right? And that's reflected in, they're not looking at how are the city of Oak Creek's taxes, they're looking at their property tax bill, right? And we know that that's been, we've tried to, and it was a little discouraging to see communication of that financial information, because that was central to our current and former strategic plan, and we did put a lot of effort into that, but we need to not rely just on Facebook, and really looks like print media is going to be where we need to do that.
And then I think my remaining questions all relate to what next and what we can do with the data, which it sounds like you'll touch base on. So then last thing, just a thank you to everybody involved. I think that even this kind of combined data and this presentation was very informative and quite eye-opening with some of the items in here. So I appreciate all the work on this. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just and the second time seeing this now for me. Danny and I got to see it last week at small leadership team presentation, but I think it's a process here. The more times you take a look at this and hear this stuff, I think it better kind of resonates and maybe gives you a better idea how this stuff is going to inform our strategic action plan process moving forward, and really trying to figure out and narrow in on and hone in on whether or not it's perception or reality or fact that is reflected in these answers. And there's some nuances in the sample base that may shade things a little bit, so we can learn a little bit more about that and deal with that and kind of take that into account as we move forward. But overall, the action here is just going to be driven by kind of diving in on some of these numbers and really figuring out, is it just an education process? Do we have an issue with housing or taxes, or is it an administration campaign? School district outreach, we obviously can't impact school district, but because we send the bill out, people assume it's a city. So it's a good start, and it's going to be our job now to kind of winnow through this and figure out what's important. And it's obviously, it's everything in government. It's an ongoing evolutionary process. So it's just the beginning.
Great, thank you, Ken. Anything, Chris?
No, thank you.
Any last words, Andrew, Max?
Yeah, so kind of next steps, Mayor and Council, really, I am really encouraged because we have already jumped to the kind of the tying of the loose ends and buts, and they want this but not that. And there is a lot here to inform your discussions in our strategic plan. There's a lot here. Now, our next steps, this is our one of our biggest data points. We are currently in the process of, we're on the precipice of sending out our employee survey to gauge us and hear feedback from us as an employer. And that's our second biggest stakeholder, right? So our residents and businesses and visitors are our biggest stakeholder. Closely second, if not 1B, is the people that work for the city, and helping us be a better employer for them, so they can continue to do the good work that the public requires. So that's kind of the second data point, is the employee survey, and then we'll jump into our strategic planning process. Now, you're probably not going to want to go through 80 slides when we're having this strategic plan conversation. So what we propose to do is we'll have a staff working group, maybe 7 to 10 folks, sit down over a few meetings and really try to provide an executive summary that you can easily digest at those strategic planning sessions. So we're not thumbing through slides, and we'll try to provide some of those connective deductions, if you will, for you. But, we'd invite, one or two of you to be on that as well once you get through the more detailed analysis and you really dig into this. Come back to it a couple of times and say, they said this here, but they also said this here. What does it mean? Because, you and the senior leadership team are going to have to figure that out. And that's through the discussion in our strategic plan. So that's what we propose to do. Synthesize the large data set and all of the feedback a little bit, so it's somewhat manageable when we're referring to it in our conversations in midsummer, late summer for the strategic planning process.
It is a very interesting survey. It says quite a bit, and the one thing it really says about us as a city is we are community driven. We've set our goals and our agendas based on some of the community needs, not just what we're hearing here tonight or our strategic plan, but going back all the way, many councils back on development of the lakefront, this property. We've always been very, very goal orientated as to what the community's needs are. So just want to really say, this is a public document. It will be out there. Again, it's not binding to us by any way, shape, or form. But again, it helps guide future decisions going forward. And a lot of these are in process. We're never going to be 100% at everything. We strive to really have the high scores, but some of these scores may not be reflective of decisions that were made here. Could just be circumstances of the current trend going on, housing, house assessments, things of that nature, coincided with our reassessment. I'm sure that reflected in our scores a little bit. Not making excuses, just saying. So it'll be a good tool, and as we go forward in budget and strategic planning, there'll be a lot to talk about with this. So with that, if there's nothing further, Will, I want to thank you for your time.
Just one more question. Yes. So does each employee get a survey, or is that a sampling as well?
No, thank you. That's a great question. No, we have, I don't know, Max, help me out, probably 320 to 340 active part-time and full-time employees, somewhere in that range at any given time. No, and our intention is to hopefully get that. We will make attempts to get that into everybody's hands. They will have an opportunity. That's really important. We are not looking at, trying to do that as a random sample of folks. We really want to hear from everyone, if at all possible, on that one.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, if not, Will, I want to thank you for your time and everybody involved in this, getting it out there. Do appreciate it. Won't be the last time we see it, so thank you very much.